So let's be clear. This genocide continues, this death machine keeps going because the ruling class, that includes our elected officials, our own government, and the billionaire elite, they all work together to keep it going, to keep this genocide as it is.
Salam, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Popular Cradle. It's Rhiannon here, and I'm joined today by Muhammad. Hey, Muhammad.
Hi, Rhi. How are you doing?
I'm good. You haven't been here with us in a while, but we're glad to have you back. How are you feeling about being back on the podcast grind?
I'm excited, honestly. I feel like I've spent the last 2 months just talking to a baby, so now I get to talk to some people.
We're glad to have you back, but we're also glad that there's an additional baby. We're glad about that baby too.
Yeah.
So we wanted to jump on today. Muhammad and I are going to talk through our reactions, some analysis here, just go through the recent developments or really recent revelations actually about this so-called Board of Peace that Trump has announced, that Jared Kushner announced at Davos last week. This Board of Peace established to basically take over governance in Gaza. Just to describe the structure really quickly, Jared Kushner went over that the Board of Peace is going to be made up by an executive board, a Gaza executive board, a national committee for the administration of Gaza. That committee reports to a high representative. It's really technocratic, bureaucratic thing. But Muhammad, what are you most struck by this recent announcement?
Yeah, I think we've had a sense of the fact that there was going to be this corporation that's created ever since Trump started talking about plans for Gaza. And Kushner's speech really sort of laid out what their intentions are in terms of a master plan, as he described it, for so-called reconstruction and development. And I think, obviously, it's significant that this structure is a very vertical structure. It's a hierarchy with Trump at the top. It's not clear if it's Trump as the chair of this Board of Peace or the president of the United States, but it seems to imply that he would serve in this role even after he ends his term as president of the United States. But
yeah, he says something, quote, it's in theory for life. I mean,
right.
Referring to the position of permanent chairman of the board.
Yeah, and I think there's so much that can be said about sort of the structure of the board, with the fact that you have, a set of Palestinians at the bottom that are meant to, I think, I'm trying to remember what the language of the resolution, because there was a resolution that was leaked to DropSite News, actually, that sort of outlines the workings or intention or plan of the actual Board of Peace. And it's this national committee made up of Palestinians is meant to execute the dictates or perform what they're authorized to perform by ultimately what it comes back down to is Trump. And I mean, it's obviously a colonial structure in nature. Basically, you have a local governing body made up of the natives that is reporting to some sort of foreign body.
Yeah.
But even then, it's usually, I don't know that it's ever been administered in this way, at least in the corporate character of it. It's a private institution. Now, there's obviously heads of state on this board, but it's really a modern neo-colonial entity. And I think we can get more into what that actually means as we talk today. So I don't know, what were your thoughts? What did you think when you heard this speech?
Yeah, this privatization model, the corporate, literal corporate structure of what's being proposed
Feels
here.
like a private equity firm that he's created.
It does. And just to the point about Palestinians being at the bottom of this structure, kind of bottom rung of the Board of Peace, in the resolution that you mentioned that was leaked to DropSite, those members, the Palestinian members of the National Committee, have to be, quote, vetted, technocratic, and apolitical.
They're middle managers.
They're middle managers and not political, not actually directing the politics of this, the governance of Palestinians, their own people in Gaza.
Yeah, there is no governance. I don't think that word exists in this model.
Yeah, exactly. And we're saying this is being built up like a corporation. You can see, yeah, there are heads of state on the executive council of the Board of Peace. Marco Rubio is on there, Steve Witkoff, who is part of the US administration, but note, even these other people on the board who, yes, might be part of the Trump administration, but where did Steve Witkoff actually come up, right? He's the founder of a private investment and a real estate development company. Tony Blair is on this board. Obviously, again, Tony Blair, former head of state, former prime minister of the UK. But currently, what is Tony Blair doing? He's like this bridge. He's like a connector in the network between world governments and private investment.
He's an Epstein-like figure.
Yeah, that's right. He's like this critical node. He's like this connector, and this is the role, obviously, that he's playing on this board here. The other thing that struck me, it's not surprising, but it can still be shocking if that's like an okay way to describe it, is that Israelis are given top position in this
Benjamin
structure.
Netanyahu himself.
Yeah, Netanyahu himself.
There's an investor, a real estate guy, I forget his name.
Yeah, Israeli billionaire Yatir Gabay, real estate developer, said to be the architect, quote unquote, behind a lot of these plans, the architect of the new Gaza. And so the privatization and corporatization of governance, not governance, it's actually a model for like exploitation of Palestinian labor and industrialization of Gaza.
Well, industrialization for, the global market in a limited sense. Yeah.
Right.
But, the thing is like, it reminds me a lot because, at the center of it all is like tourism. It's supposed to be like, Trump is so obsessed with the idea that there's this like huge beachfront, and Gaza sits on the Mediterranean. But it reminds me of like a lot of the Caribbean, the way that, or, maybe Southeast Asia, where there's like these resort towns or like resort areas, these territories that are completely sort of privatized. They're like, for Western consumption.
Yeah, it's like an imperial playground.
Right. People fly into the local airport and then they drive, not mingling or interacting with the locals at all, and then go into this resort that's like closed off, gated. And that's supposed to be, almost it's a separate political territory. But, and we would describe that situation as colonial. That's really, it's fucked up and it's exploitative and it's imperialistic and whatever. But it's worse than that. Like, at the very least, like, let's say take the Dominican Republic. There's a Dominican Republic government, Of
course. Yeah.
Now, obviously, it's ceded aspects of its territory for international exploitations or to private companies. In this situation, we're not even imagining a Palestinian domestic political player that is negotiating on behalf of the people, the relationship between the territory and this foreign body or the foreign entity or these private corporations. So it reminded me of that, but also gave us a sort of a glimpse into the future of how bad things are going to be. We talk about sort of the neoliberal turn, and now we're in a different turn in a way, like we're in this techno-feudal turn where, billionaires and private actors and their corporations and these, private equity firms, have come to dominate even global, quote unquote, governance, right? They're displacing international institutions. The Board of Peace required an initial investment of $1 billion for every board member.
To be on the board, yeah.
Exactly. And the idea is that money is then going to be sort of activated or used, and there's a return on investment expected. Unlike, you would imagine for like UNRWA, for example, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, right? Like with UNRWA, it was created by the UN to administer the affairs of Palestinian refugees in the surrounding states, wherever those refugees were. And Palestinians filled those roles, and it's like a negotiated agreement, and international countries are sort of funding it for the sake and betterment of the Palestinian people, setting aside all of its flaws and problems and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, there wasn't a profit-driven logic that underlies the creation of UNRWA and this idea that private actors fill those roles as opposed to some sort of an agreement between different states. So, there's a lot more to be said about this dynamic between the UN and this Board of Peace and what Trump is trying to do. But, these are the things that really I thought through. And when I saw the plan that Kushner laid out, where he has like data centers, industrial base, tourism base. And it's like,
this is what Rafah will be like. Rafah, he says, is going to be mostly housing for laborers.
It's a hellscape and it's really scary. And, in a way, I think what Trump realized is when he came out and said, we're going to own Gaza, he realized that he can't sell it that way and that he needed to rebrand. And this is the rebranding, but the devil is in the details. The structure that they've actually laid out, the plan they've laid out, is Trump and the UAE and this Israeli billionaire and etc. owning Gaza, essentially, and figuring out a solution for the Palestinian presence on the land by either making them laborers or making it to where they never have a say in the future of their country.
Yeah. And we should get into, maybe we'll get into in a second, the effect, like what this actually would look like for, Palestinian self-determination, the people of Gaza. But to your point, I do think we should dive into like what Trump is proposing here as an alternative to the United Nations. Right. Yeah. As an alternative to sort of cooperative international. Of course, we have criticisms of the United Nations, like you said, not a perfect body, not perfect in how it's led or anything like that. But an alternative to like cooperative sort of international and transnational governance. And this is full privatization, saying like we will be a colonial structure, like purely profit driven. And I think there is a lot to be said about that. Like you said, as a glimpse into the future of where sort of like international governance is going, where the world economy is going. We're seeing it like so acutely here in this example in Palestine, in Gaza. But it was reminding me of, I'm sure that you've been reading, seeing about like Trump's plans, intentions to take over Greenland. And I learned recently what a charter city is, or a freedom city, which is like what the Elon Musks of the world and the Mark Andreessens and the Peter Thiels want to create in Greenland and have created all over the world in specific examples. But Greenland is sort of like ripe for this, which is like the creation of cities, zones that are completely free of regulation, right? That can be built literally just for profit, that are about exploiting labor, little industries governed by techno-fascists, right? And so anyways, I think it's important to emphasize that like the Board of Peace and this plan for controlling Gaza really, really does sort of like portend a lot about the world economy and sort of US interference and dominance over the economy, like all over the world, right?
I think billionaires have recognized or come to realize that the nation state and by extension, the international global order or international institutions are sort of a ceiling on their ability to acquire and exercise power. And in fact, they need to supplant it or weaken the role of the state. And, the irony of that is that a strong US was effectively an empire, that's what has happened over the last few decades since World War II. The US emerged as the sort of global hegemon. And now they see the global hegemon as a limit on their individual capacity to acquire power. And so now they're reshaping US empire. They're now sort of taking the tools and machinery of US empire and wielding it in a way that's about dividing up the world in their favor. And, what I think this produces is it's like an old money, new money dynamic. On the one hand, there are beneficiaries to old empire, and those people are going to sort of fight. And that's what we're kind of seeing now with some of the responses or reactions from Europe or whatever. But at the same time, this is the ascendancy and the leverage that the US was able to sort of gain over the European countries now is being used to effectively execute the strategy of, securing the interests of all of these individual billionaires, these techno-feudalists, and by extension, Trump and his family, their power on a global level. And Mark Carney, I'm sure you've seen his speech, the Prime Minister of Canada, where he basically said, listen, the mask's off. He gave this speech actually at Davos himself, and he talked about the fact that basically, I don't know. Did you see the speech, Mark Carney's
I didn't.
speech?
And that's what I was going to ask you. Like, I actually haven't seen like any Western head of state or anybody like that, like oppose this. Is that what he was doing?
Well, Mark Carney basically said, there was this deal where we all would pretend to believe in the liberal global order, right? We gave up national defense in a way to the US, and what he described, it was like this sort of tale where like everyone put this sign up on their door that we believe in the liberal world order, the rules-based order, human rights, yada, yada, with recognizing that the powerful were exempt. And as long as we aligned with the powerful, we benefited from it. Mm-hmm. But now no one's pretending anymore. And so it's time to take our sign down. And he's really describing the dynamic between the US and, the rest of the European countries. It's like, we went along with your charade, and now you're turning on us in a way. The trade agreements that we benefited from that were at the expense of the global South, for example,
right?
The way that the dollar was pricing, for example, oil, or it became the sort of global reserve currency, all of that we were benefiting from because we were aligned with you. But now you are treating us as not aligned with you, but as his competitors, and leveraging the dependency you created in us on you to attack us, to hurt us, to get better, to even exploit. I hate to use the word exploit because these are ultimately like imperialist countries themselves, but to squeeze out every drop of surplus from these countries to leverage in trade, right?
They're making sure that the class that benefits is even smaller. They're squeezing it like as tight as possible, right?
And so he's like, we're not going to play this game anymore. And so that's why we're going to enter into trade relations with China. That's why we're going to sign this deal. Like, everyone has to look out for themselves. We don't have to pretend anymore. And now it's about spheres of influence, and like Trump and his national defense strategy, they laid this out in their document, are basically saying, the Western hemisphere is ours. Mm-hmm. And now Canada, that's a problem for Canada. You know what I mean? The question is whether the European countries like buy this. You have someone like Gavin Newsom, for example, saying, oh, well, don't worry about it because, in 3 years, someone else is going to be in power and maybe we go back to the charade. But I don't know. It's a mask off moment. All of it's just a continuation and extension of that. That's before we get into Venezuela and Iran and everything else that's happened around it. But all of it is a part of this trend. Yeah. And Gaza is just a microcosm. It's the one that exposes it most readily.
Well, let's get into the microcosm, like jump in a little bit and talk about on the ground people in Gaza right now. Like the question of like aid getting in, like are people in Gaza not being starved right now? Is aid coming in now? What the Board of Peace proposes for food, water, medicine coming into the Strip in the near term, I'm saying, right? Like for the people of Gaza in the very short term, the immediate term, what's going on for them? And then also, what reconstruction of Gaza looks like while all of this real estate development plan is being implemented. Kushner said that all of this will be in place, they're proposing in 2 to 3 years. Like how is the population of Gaza going to be moved during this time while this mass construction project essentially is happening across the Strip?
I mean, the priority still remains on the part of the Israelis to get Palestinians out of Gaza.
Yeah.
And so like that priority is executed now in this moment under the cover of this supposed plan by continuing to restrict aid, by continue to prevent Palestinians from actually building shelter, right? Especially in the middle of this winter where people are, children are dying from hypothermia. Children are still dying from starvation or malnutrition. That's all happening currently as we speak. And so the genocide isn't sort of off, it's in its new phase. And that phase has a new political cover. And that political cover is called the Board of Peace and the Master Plan. And, so I think that's a true reality, as it is a true reality for settler terror in the West Bank and what Palestinians are experiencing in the West Bank in terms of campaign of dispossession and displacement that's happening there. And so that's the reality. They've talked about opening up the Rafah border under the condition that the amount of Palestinians that leave versus the amount that enter has to be a net loss
right.
in terms of
to the population of Gaza, right?
To the population of Gaza, yes, correct. Aid is still being conditioned. Reconstruction is being conditioned on something called disarmament, something that's never been agreed to, even though every day they come out and say the Palestinian resistance has agreed to disarm and stuff like that. And it was never a part of the discussions of the initial plan anyways. Reconstruction cannot be predicated on that. So I think it's still a horrible condition. And I think this naturally goes into like, what's the task at hand moving forward in light of this, right? Like, if we understand the priority to be to displace Palestinians and then sort of destroy any prospect of future for Palestinian nationhood, then what do we do to confront it? I think, ultimately we have a responsibility to expose the sort of character of this system.
Yeah.
And not just for our ability to confront it in Gaza, but for our ability to confront it wherever it's going to manifest itself in the future. And best believe, we know it's going to manifest itself, wherever there's scarcity, wherever there's conflict, wherever there is a need to exploit and oppress. This is the system that's going to be rolled out and implemented, and it's been tested and perfected in Gaza. But now we also see like really this intersection between tech and defense taking off. Mm-hmm. And it is a part of our future. The Palantir, we say the word Palantir and people sort of really obsess about it, but Palantir actually is one of many of hundreds of these startup companies, of these tech meets defense, consumer meets public interest corporations that have come to dominate every facet of human life, mm-hmm. And if they have a vision of the world, and this is what's really important. On the one hand, you could say they're profit driven, which is true. But at some point, you've accumulated enough profit. Like, what more can you accumulate? What more can you do in that regard? They have an ideological vision. They have a vision of the future where they see a problem they need to solve then, planned for now. And that is through control and surveillance and stuff like that. And when we say techno-fascism, I think it's not like a sloganeering word.
Right.
It's not a sort of way to attack or discredit, these people. They're fascistic.
It accurately describes, right?
Their vision of the world is rooted in this.
The way they profit, the sort of industry, the economic part, this tech part, and the ideology.
About who they view as lesser than, about the fact that they need to build out a system in a state that serves this vision of the world. Mm-hmm. And they need to secure it for a subset of people. Maybe in 1930s, it was defined as blood and soil, or defined as Aryan or-ness or whatever, whatever sort of category. Now they've figured out a new category of people that they can include and exclude. And, unfortunately, the Palestinian people are one of the early cases to experience what this future vision of the world holds.
Well, let's get into what the Board of Peace means for Palestinian politics, right? The Palestinian political future. Where are the Palestinian factions in this? We know they're not included in the board of peace and not actual decision makers, right? But the Palestinian political factions, I mean, even the PA, the Palestinian Authority, and that comprador class, which we've talked about briefly before on the podcast, like where do the Palestinian people's political will, where does that get expressed?
Well, you say comprador class, I'd even go as far as to say old comprador class, because like we're in a new system now.
Yeah.
You have no relevance, like the PA.
Right.
What is being envisioned in Gaza is worse than what happened in the post-Oslo moment. Like at the very least, what you can say about Oslo and the Palestinian Authority is it was genuine local rule, right? There was some level of actual governance, civil administration by Palestinians, right? Setting aside the fact that, there's a repression of resistance to the occupation, setting aside security coordination and all of this stuff, setting aside the fact that there was Palestinian monopolists that benefited from this arrangement, but at the same time, it's Palestinian rule, like in a literal sense, with a couple of asterisks. I don't need to get into those asterisks, but it's Palestinian rule. There's not even the theater of that anymore in what's happening and proposed in Gaza. And the Palestinian factions on some level, I think, recognize that this is a moment where the balance of power does not allow an actual confrontation with this moment in the implementation of the plan. The plan has to be implemented on the ground. And the moment for confrontation with the implementation will come. It's not going to come in statements. It's not going to come in lobbying who gets to be on what. And in fact, from what I understand, the National Committee of Palestinians that is supposed to be a part of this sort of structure was agreed upon by the factions, or at least a plurality of them agreed upon these names. Not because they trust them politically, not because they sort of see them as actors that would safeguard Palestinian self-determination or rights or what have you, but they believe them to be at least technically sophisticated enough to advance the roles that they need to play for the betterment of the people of Gaza. Now, at the end of the day, this is a political plan that will need to be confronted. And there's a reality that people who draw up plans have to contend with, and that's the presence of Palestinians and a desire for political, self-determination, a desire for actual achievement of rights. And that's not going anywhere, no matter what sort of plan they devise.
Right.
Now, what I will say is that at the same time that Palestinians understand this is a moment where you have the balance of power to confront this, the Israelis, and I think by extension the Americans, understand that they need to create a system on the ground of control, of security,
right,
that will anticipate that coming moment of confrontation. And that's being worked on right now. That's being worked on behind the yellow line, the line that divides the area that the Israeli occupation remains in, that they're creating facts on the ground there. That's in the actual biometric system that they're trying to implement and tie to aid and reconstruction. That's going to tie to the way that the occupation is actually going to continue. And the system of mass incarceration is going to continue. And the system of surveillance and control will continue. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty dark in a way, but at the same time, I think the resolve to confront it is almost guarantee.
Right.
It's built in.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if I told you this off the podcast, but I met with a young person who spent I think 6 or 7 years in the US Navy, and was raised in was raised very conservative and thinking that serving in the military is really great and US patriotism, yay. And he says that he was radicalized and he left the Navy and now is a totally different person politically and morally and everything else, because he spent a lot of time in the Red Sea as a US Navyman and around the Gulf states in general. And he said a lot of time they spent was boarding Yemeni fishermen's boats and collecting biometric data from them and getting off. And just like going to the next one, you know? So anyways, you know, that's a total tangent, but you see again the microcosm, right? That like Gaza, Palestine, what they're doing there shows us so much. Is it's mask off on the way that U.S. empire functions in a lot of ways, and what is sort of like ascendant in U.S. empire's practices right now. Let's say, but turning back to the resolution and details that were revealed in this resolution about the Board of Peace. You know, again, thinking about what happens to the population of Gaza, like what happens to people on the ground. What does this look like? I mentioned Yakir Gabe, this Israeli billionaire real estate guy who claims he's building the new Gaza. That real estate plan divides the Gaza Strip in ways that we've already said make it easier to exploit labor, install industrial production in these zones. There are residential zones, residential areas that are designed to be in proximity to industrial zones and tourist zones. A lot of those industrial zones are like conveniently placed on Israel's borders, which, you know, seems to suggest that they're going to be used to serve Israel's economy and production, which, you know, in line with a long history of Palestinian labor in the West Bank, but acutely also in Gaza, historically being used in Israel for the Israeli economy. The main highways and railroads that are proposed in this, you know, real estate development of Gaza plan, they're not along like the historic Salah ad-Din road through Gaza, but they're made to facilitate from industrial zones to the port and to the airport, of course, right? And you mentioned the yellow line, you know, all around the strip in the detailed plans here, all around the strip, there's a full buffer zone. We can only assume, of course, that it would be for the IOF, for American forces to be occupying, controlling completely. And, you know, that maintains the threat and likely the reality of a blockade at any moment, another siege, even though they're saying that like, oh, Rafah is going to be open now and borders are going to be open now and people can come and go from Gaza. Everything is still going to be controlled. Every person that passes the border, right? And all food, all aid, everything, right? Imports and exports. What this plan lays out in detail is full Israeli and American control of all of that.
Yeah. No, you know, there's also like, I mean, it's really dystopic, and the more you break it down, the more it feels like a movie, you know, it feels like the Hunger Games, you know, in terms of how things are divided and how people are sort of corralled into like concentrated and specifically relegated to certain types of labor. You know, there's a lot of discussion about these things called planned communities for Gazans, and there's sort of communities, I mean, it's a euphemism for concentration camps that are between checkpoints, you know, the same, if not worse, than what we see in the West Bank, and surrounded militarily by, you know, military outposts. There are over 50 military outposts currently built in Gaza by the Israelis. 12 have been built since October. And, you know, this is research done by Dropsite News and Forensic Architecture that's really like mapping out building up of both natural geographic engineering, you know, dooms, and creating like sort of natural obstacles in the actual nature of Gaza to prevent people's movements or to keep them concentrated in a very specific way, but also like literal military outposts with roads that go in and out of Israel, you know, or in and out of Rafah, that are meant to allow for a sustained military occupation that you're describing. And these planned communities are governed by this biometric system. Like, so your entry and exit into them is regulated on an individual level, like by your identity, and you are vetted. And what does it mean to be vetted? You know, that's a huge question. We already know what it means to be vetted in the sort of from the perspective of the IDF in terms of the massacres they you know, like the Where's Daddy, or you know, these AI systems that they developed for targeting Palestinians in the Gaza Strip during the genocide. So there's some sort of vetting system about your level of acquiescence, your level of you know, docileness. Like
what level of threat, quote unquote, do you pose to?
How much are you willing to go along to get along? And even then, there's like, I remember reading, I don't know if I heard this in an interview, but one of the drop site contributors was talking about how one of their conditions for people being a part of this planned community is that they prefer extended families, like families with you know, multiple layers of multi-generationals, because that is like more conducive. This is how they say it, like more conducive to cohesion, right? When you have all of these different generations. And what he noted or flagged was like, well, how many Palestinian families in Gaza have had their lineages or lines or multiple generations completely wiped out? You know, like actually a large segment of the Palestinian population does not fall under this categorization and is thus excluded from participation by virtue of the fact that their family members were massacred. You know, so it's a hellscape, you know, what they're describing. And it is a the modernization of, like, you know, the Palantierization of genocide execution post massacre style like genocide execution. I don't know how to describe it. It's just like genocide by other means or by more technological means.
Right. And just how, you know, maybe, for example, like weapons manufacturers and the CEOs of weapons companies were greatly enriched and greatly profited off of, you know, the bombing, the decimation by bombardment of Gaza, and that sort of phase of the massacre. You know, there are other techno-fascists and techno-feudalists who are here like waiting in the wings or deciding on a different kind of acceleration of their profiteering and their benefit off of, you know, a new phase of the genocide, right? One that is maybe more technological, one where they are experimenting still on Palestinians, testing their technology, their products that they're developing, testing them on the people of Gaza, and enriching themselves all the while, and of course with the next phase being the expansion of the use of that technology all over the world. And when you start to see, you know, these structures, let's say the Board of Peace, when you start to break it down and analyze it for what it is, you know, a new colonial system, et cetera, all the stuff that we've been talking about, you know, I think that clarifies actually for many in the movement and just in thinking about this continued protracted long-term struggle for you know, the Palestinian nation, a national liberation struggle. You are able to start to identify how Zionism, the Zionist project, and you know, imperialism in general, how it's propped up, like the bricks, the pillars that hold up the project and perpetuate it. And so, you know, the Board of Peace is just one example at showing the economic pillar that holds up the project, certainly the political pillar. And it's important for us to be clear and to identify these things, because then that illuminates, you know, what bricks can be removed, right? If this is the Jenga tower, then what pieces can be removed? What can be chipped away at? What can be targeted so that over the long term, the project is dismantled? You know, we're talking, I guess I feel often this is, you've already said it, like this is dark, you know, we're talking about a massive, it's dystopic, it's dark, the worst kind of outcomes for humanity we're talking about right now. And so that feels so overwhelming. But actually, like, our analysis here, to keep it sharp, is to identify these things really clearly in order to know what can be done,
Right. And it's to leverage our strength in the face of these systems, and the strength is in our numbers ultimately. Like, and that's a friend. I had a friend recently who was visiting Palestine, and he hadn't been there in years. And he was born and raised in Al-Quds. And for a while, he couldn't even go back. And he came back, and I said, how is the situation there? Like, how are people's morale? Like, wow, like, what can you say? And he's like, there's a lot I can say about how bad the situation is and how difficult it is. But there's a reality that, the Israelis and really everyone has to contend with, is that there's millions of us. We're literally everywhere. And he's like, I went everywhere. I went all over Palestine. And it's like they spent 2 years executing one of the most brutal campaigns, not just on the people of Gaza, but like on the Palestinian people as a people, right?
Yeah.
Trying to sear into our consciousness, the consciousness of not just Palestinians living in Gaza, but every Palestinian, wherever they may find themselves, that they should succumb, they should give up, they should leave, And yet there's so many of us. There's so many of us on the ground despite what's happened. And yet that's not enough. Like, the most important thing that we're now tasked with is actually building unity around a political program in the face of this sort of difficult moment. And that political program is enrooted in part on the ability to like raise consciousness for people around the task at hand, but also to move them in a direction. And it's only then that we can actually confront the system that we're up against. And so I think we'll have to leave it for another episode to get further into that.
Yeah, that's a big topic, probably for another day, probably for many, many conversations into the future. So I think we will wrap our conversation there. Thank you for joining us on Popular Cradle, and we will see you next time. Popular Cradle is made in partnership with the Palestinian Youth Movement. Thank you to the many people who contributed to the making of this episode. Our editor is Soraya Shockley. Our artwork is by Shenbi G and Vivek Venkatraman. Our theme music is composed by Salma Talib and performed by Clarissa Bitar and Hisham Jarmakani. Follow, like, and subscribe to us on social media at Popular Cradle. That's YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram at Popular Cradle.